Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm doing a triple feature on the KLF. Alright, so my next planned discography review is going to be the Orb, since I've been promising that series for ages but putting it off for so long. But I feel like before I get into that series, I should talk about a band that's an integral part of the Orb's history and deserves at least one video all to themselves: the KLF. At first I was just going to do a video talking about their seminal 1990 ambient album Chill Out, which, spoilers, is a personal favorite of all time. But given this is also a prelude to a series on the Orb, I also thought I needed to talk about Jimmy Cauty's solo album Space. And if I was going to talk about both of those, screw it, I'll also talk about The White Room at the end, even if that album's got nothing to do with the Orb, because it was unlikely I was going to talk about it in any other context, and I have a feeling I'd get people asking me about it. So yes, I'm going to be talking about the KLF, the duo of Jimmy Cauty and Bill Drummond. These guys were only around for a few years, but boy did they make a splash in that time span as a simultaneous pop band, ambient collective, weird Dadaist art collective, etc., often using lots of super blatant, uncleared samples that got them in a lot of legal trouble, fitting for a band whose name is short for Copyright Liberation Front. Nearly everything that came out of this duo was some kind of piss take on the greater music industry, especially their early stuff in the late 80s as the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo and the Time Lords, when the latter alias netted them a #1 hit called Doctor in the TARDIS, which was basically just a mashup of the Doctor Who theme with Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll Part 2. They responded to that success by writing and publishing a manual about how to get a #1 hit without any money or talent, which also happens to recommend people not actually attempt it, since being known for that one thing you did can actually be entirely detrimental to your career. When they saw a lot of commercial success for their various pop and dance singles as the KLF, a year after they released the whole White Room album, they appeared on the 1992 Brit Awards. Bill Drummond took out a gun and fired blanks into the audience, had an announcer say they'd retired from the music industry, they dumped a dead sheep in the after-show party, and forced their entire back catalog to immediately go out of print a few months later. And most infamously and controversially of all, in 1994, they took £1 million in cash from all their earnings over the years, publicly burned it, and filmed the burning as art. Also, from what I heard, they sold the ashes to be displayed at a gallery and sold the film and the rights to it to a TV channel to make the $1 million back. Though citation needed on that. The press at the time focused entirely on the burning itself, and I only heard that last part from a Discogs comment. Also, a decade after the fact, Bill Drummond publicly expressed his regret at having gone through with the whole burning money thing, and that he couldn't fully put in the words together to express why they actually did it. Yeah, depending on who you ask, these guys may be better remembered for their antics outside of the music than they are for the music itself, but I'm still here to talk about the music itself, since, of course, that's the stuff that's most important to me, regardless of any weird controversies they got into at the time. They did still make one of my favorite ambient albums of all time in 1990 over here with Chill Out. One that I have been legit excited to talk about in some capacity, since it really doesn't seem to get brought up very often these days. As for the Orb's relevance to Chill Out, supposedly Alex Patterson had some kind of involvement with the project. I think some of the material here was based on stuff that he and Cauty did in separate unreleased sessions around the time the Orb itself was in its earliest stages, when it was first conceived as a KLF side project consisting of just Patterson and Cauty. We'll get to that story more later. While Patterson is not credited anywhere on Chill Out itself, there are still a few signs in the Orb's catalog that point towards his involvement here. There's an Orb comp called Orb Sessions Volume 1 that has a track called Mummy Don't, which very heavily resembles the segment on this album called 3 AM Somewhere Out of Beaumont. Also, this album has a track called Madrugada Eterna, which is Spanish for Eternal Dawn, and one of the most recognizable singles from the early days of the Orb that made it onto their debut album is called Perpetual Dawn. And even though the two tracks have absolutely nothing in common sonically, I seriously doubt these similar titles are just a coincidence. Regardless of who was involved or not involved in the creation, though, Chill Out is still a brilliant listen from start to finish. A stone-cold timeless classic in my eyes. It's a single 45-minute piece separated into 14 distinct segments and recorded live all in one single take. The entire experience is meant to evoke a road trip from Texas to Louisiana, and it's unlike any other ambient project I've ever heard before or since. There's such a wide variety of sounds that passes you by over the project's running time, from field recordings to meandering steel guitar passages to blatant samples of classic rock songs and radio DJs and more. And all of it fits together perfectly to set up that same sense of environment. Despite how blatant the sampling can get, I associate the vast majority of those samples specifically with how they were implemented into this album. Right from the very beginning with the first segment, Brownsville Turnaround on the Tex-Mex Border, you just get simple recordings of crickets, a few Mexican radio announcers, a sample in the background of their own track Justified and Ancient, a version of it, a passing train, a bit of steel guitar, and then just after a minute it goes right into Pulling Out of Ricardo and the Dusk is Falling Fast, where it feels like the album properly opens up with these warm and immersive chords that are somewhere between synths and guitars that end up getting reprised in several other different cuts throughout this album, most notably Madrugada Eterna, which fleshes the sounds out to a full 7-minute piece and combines it with sprawling and moody steel guitar excursions, a radio DJ talking about Brooklyn, New York, all the way down to East Coast. Get ready! Also a news broadcaster describing a fatal car accident, and other various whooshing effects. It creates just such a well-enveloping and immersive vibe throughout. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the longer tracks on here, like this, tend to be pretty major favorites. But even like a 2-minute cut, like Dreamtime in Lake Jackson, can leave an impact. Mostly thanks to that one's implementation of samples from two Van throat singers. I'd never heard anyone sing like that before I heard this album. It's such a weird tone of voice that sounds like the singer is on the verge of choking on something, but still manages to sound good somehow. And anytime anyone implements throat singers like this in their music, it is going to remind me of this specific moment. And there's lots of other short tracks that just have little samples that are really blatant, but they stick out in my mind so much. Especially Elvis on the radio Steel Guitar in My Soul, which implements a really obvious sample of In the Ghetto, and somehow became my strongest association with that particular song. If I hear the original Elvis Presley recording, it's just gonna remind me of this album instead. It's so emotionally charged and fits so well into the overall vibe of the album. And similar thoughts on the melancholy clarinet melody pulled out of Acker Bilk's Stranger on the Shore being used in the track A Melody from a Past Life Keeps Pulling Me Back. I'd never heard it before I heard this album, but it was just so sweet and nostalgic, and the way it sunk into the mix made me feel like I'd known it for years. Or the Van Halen guitar solo being combined with those punchy Tommy Vance radio DJ samples of rock radio into the 90s and beyond. Which I find myself internally quoting whenever I hear that kind of punchy radio DJ single, whether it's related or not. Only track sampled on this album that didn't become permanently associated with its use here was probably 808 States Pacific, which shows up on The Lights of Baton Rouge Pass By. Obviously, my history with 808 States stretches back quite a bit farther than my history with the KLF, but I still remember getting excited when I heard this project for the first time and that sample came up. I'm like, ooh, it's 808 States! But that does pretty much just leave my two favorite cuts here that I have to discuss. There's the 9.5-minute Behemoth, 3 a.m. somewhere out of Beaumont, which is mainly characterized by these loops of ride cymbals and this 2-note keyboard loop that sounds pulled out of Pink Floyd's Echoes. There's voice snippets from a track called After the Love by Boy George's band Jesus Loves You. And they kind of echo and chop it up and made me think for years it was saying After the Light is Gone, because this track is supposed to evoke, driving through the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. I think I heard a bit of those choirs that would get utilized on the Orbs track, A Huge Ever-Growing Pulsating Brain. There's long segments that get taken up by this melancholy loop of acoustic guitars that I could have sworn were originally recorded for this album, much like the steel guitars and all the other parts throughout here. But they're really taken from an old Fleetwood Mac track called Albatross. As many different sounds as this track meanders through, it still all fits together as if, it was almost like the way it was supposed to originally sound or something. But as great as that track is, I think my favorite cut here has to be the one that comes right after it, Wichita Linemen was a song I once heard. This one doesn't rely so heavily on direct sampling, but instead utilizes all these whirring melodies and pads, mostly borrowed from their track Last Train to Trancentral, that create this really catchy original tune that like fades in and out and ends up becoming the most memorable part of the whole album. Also bringing back that shouting DJ from Madrugada Eterna, has little sidetracks into high-pitched synth string pads and some deep voice narrator saying that he's from somewhere. It's all very lo-fi, but it's freaking lovely from beginning to end. There are other cuts here I haven't mentioned, mostly since they act as transitional devices or reprise elements from other tracks, but all of them feel important to the overall mix and none of them feel skippable. And it is worth noting that while this album cannot be legally streamed in its original form, earlier this year they did re-release this album retitled as Come Down Dawn and put it on streaming platforms in a somewhat rearranged fashion. And most of the blatant samples removed, so no more Elvis, no more Fleetwood Mac, no more 808 State or Ackerbilk. Only the stuff that the KLF either owned or had a license to use, like the sound effects and field recordings and stuff. As you may guess, it's really not the same without those samples. I can't recommend that re-edited version as highly as a result, but enough of the core album remains where I would not say the experience was outright ruined. I think Come Down Dawn even got, like, remastered and has a sonic clarity to it that I don't get as much out of the original, which has a slightly scrappier, lo-fi quality to it, I guess. Whatever the case, I'm obviously going to give all my highest recommendations to the original version of Chill Out. This album is just such a giant linchpin in my life and my taste in ambient music, and still stands alone as such a unique experience to this day. I've obviously heard plenty of ambient projects that were assembled in a very similar way, as I'll get into when I start reviewing the Orb's catalog, but there isn't any other project I know of that captures this specific vibe of being out on a road trip through the countryside. And as someone who's been on several long road trips that go through the middle of nowhere in the US, I can confirm it's spot on with capturing that experience. Even though I don't think Caudy or Drummond had been on such a road trip themselves at the time when they made it, they'd only seen like pictures of the Deep South and that whole area and were just inspired by that imagery. Still freaking nailed it. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say this album's 10 out of 10 material or anything. I don't know if it's going to completely sweep you off your feet on first listen, and I do know of quite a few other ambient projects that have either connected with me on an even deeper emotional level than this, or I think are even better produced. Or if you happen to be one of those closed-minded people who thinks their accomplishments don't count as much because they relied so heavily on all these blatant samples, then it'll probably not be as worth it to you, but I obviously do not take much stock in that mindset. Chill Out is still a major all-time favorite and an experience unlike anything else out there. I'll have to give it a 9.3 out of 10. And now that I'm through talking about that, I do also have two other KLF-related projects to discuss. Don't have as much to say about these, but I don't feel like it would be right for me to gloss over them entirely. So first of all, since I mentioned this video is supposed to be a prelude to a series on the Orb, I obviously have to talk about Jimmy Cauty's solo album, a self-titled release under the alias Space. This project is a lot more integral to the story of the Orb than even Chill Out was, because Space was originally going to be the Orb's debut album. Cauty and Patterson had been working on this together, but they got into a major argument during its development. Allegedly, Cauty wanted the Orb to remain a side project of the KLF, while Patterson had much bigger plans for the Orb and wanted it to grow into its own thing, and I'm sure there were other disagreements beyond that. So, Cauty basically just walked out of the Orb altogether immediately after, and took the recordings they already had with him, and then proceeded to remove all of Patterson's contributions and release it as his own solo album. Not the most comfortable listen given that backstory, and parts of it do feel a bit undercooked by my ears. That it's the project of something that two people were once working on, but one half of which had their contributions removed. It does kind of show if you do know that. Some people have said that this project is right on par with Chill Out and equally as essential a listen, if not even better. I unfortunately do not hold that opinion myself, but it does definitely manage to be a really fun listen, all things considered, and I do still find myself in the mood to put it on every now and then. I've kept it on my iPod this whole time. It's this nice small 38-minute piece with 8 segments, each one named after a planet in the solar system, aside from Earth. And it's way more minimalistic a listen than Chill Out. And Chill Out was already relatively thin and simplistic, but Space strips things down even further, evoking space by channeling the lonely emptiness thereof. I mean, we're not quite at the, Biosphere Auteur de la Lune level of emptiness. There is still plenty of texture to latch onto throughout. But the first half of this project especially has a lot of really thin sections that don't have much going on. To me, this project doesn't really start to get going until its third segment, Mars. The Mercury segment is mostly just the sound of a rocket taking off, and the Venus segment is even more empty and silent, and most characterized by this whooshing sound that switches between the left and right ears and kind of gives me a headache. Also, the Pluto segment that closes the project out kind of just meanders through a bunch of disparate ideas and sound effects that I suppose symbolize returning to Earth or something, but don't make for that much of a well-developed track in its own right. Not that this project seems to be concerned with separating individual tracks. There is no separation between tracks on official releases, and the track lengths are really just estimations. But yeah, aside from those sections and that one part at the end of the Jupiter segment, which has this really pitched up sample of a performance of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which was not only kind of corny and on the nose, but also just sounded annoying, was not a fan of that little moment. But the rest of this project is really solid. Mars has a lot of marching, minimal, Tangerine Dream-esque synth progressions and sequences that are quite immersive. Jupiter has a lot of nice, plinky electric piano chords that create a more laid-back mood and surprisingly work quite well against those occasional opera samples. But the project even picks up significantly in its second half. The Saturn segment has all these super dramatic synth progressions going up against more choirs, and it sounds huge and expansive despite how little actually goes into it. And even picks up a bit more of a groove as it goes on with all these subtle plunking bass lines and mild drum machines. And the Uranus segment is just as impressive, but with a much stronger backbeat and bass line that sounds influenced by really early Mr. Fingers style deep house, with all these twinkling orchestral samples placed on top. It sounds freaking gorgeous. If only it and the Saturn segment had lasted longer. Both are finished before they even break 3 minutes and feel like they got cut off before they really got the chance to fully live out their full potential. Thankfully, the Neptune segment is a nice healthy 9.5 minutes. Mostly just the same loops of synth chords going through the whole time, with usual choir samples and proto-deep house bass lines joining in later. It's really freaking nice, too. I mean, as many issues as I have with Space as it is, it's still a really solid album across the board and has more to enjoy than it doesn't. I do think it seriously pales in comparison to Chill Out, and obviously what Patterson would go on to do with the Orb's actual debut album. And I don't feel like it's as consistent as some people have made it out to be. But it is certainly a very tight and concise listen, and still manages to feel very open and expansive in that short time, while feeling like a complete enough experience to stand on its own. It's not one of my favorites of all time, but it's definitely worth giving a shot, and I'll give it a strong 7.5 out of 10. And hey, like I said, a lot of people have said this is on par with Chill Out or even better, so maybe it'll even resonate a lot deeper for you than it did for me. But finally, I'll throw in one last project to talk about from the KLF, which has absolutely no relevance to the Orb, but again, I have a feeling I likely wouldn't have been compelled to talk about in any other context. Let's talk about their last album before retiring and deleting their catalog, The White Room from 1991. Now, for this one, just throw out any expectations that Chill Out or Space might have set up. This is not the ambient KLF, not even remotely, and it's also not the instrumental KLF. It's the super commercially successful pop KLF that I was talking about in the beginning of this video. The White Room is a house album that's super commercial and flashy, often described as the progenitor of stadium house, like blaring but hyper-polished acid house meant to be played to large crowds of people, and even adding in the sound of live crowds. A lot of people consider this album to also be a classic in its own right and a linchpin in the formation of house music as we know it today. And they certainly got a lot of big hits out of it, like What Time Is Love, 3 AM Eternal, and Last Train to Trancentral. Well, I think some, if not all of those, were hits before this album actually dropped, but same difference. As for me, maybe there's something I'm missing as someone who is not there to see these guys at their heights. Like, by the time I was born, these guys had already retired and burned $1 million. But I've personally never really cared for this one, honestly. And I've even kind of had a hard time figuring out what people saw to be so great in it. I mean, when I first heard it back in high school, I absolutely hated it and thought it was terrible. A massive letdown having gone into it with chill-out level expectations. And, you know, I've always figured those expectations were exactly the problem. It's so obviously not trying to be that kind of album or serve that audience. But even coming back to it now, knowing exactly what it is and what it's trying to do, I just don't know if I can fully sign off on this as the true classic that some people have said it is. See, the thing about this album is that it is unbelievably cheesy, and in a very specific way that you really only saw in 1991. I think I mentioned that this album is not instrumental. There's a lot of like R&B guest vocalists and even guest rappers that all sound extremely of their time and are totally overselling everything in their attempts to hype up the KLF and the justified ancients of Moo Moo, and pretty much every single track is brought down by whatever hired vocalists are on top. Now, knowing these guys' senses of humor and general MO, I have a strong feeling that's kind of the entire point. I've seen a lot of people describe this entire album as a piss take, meant to make fun of the entire popular music scene at the time, that they were half considered a joke band at the time specifically because of material like this. When you hire all these rappers and singers to talk about how cool the KLF are and have to give shoutouts to the justified ancients of Moo Moo while pretending that isn't an inherently ridiculous sounding name, I mean, it feels like the equivalent of setting up all their guests to de-pants themselves in public or something. Though I'll tell you what, the one part of the joke that I do really have to appreciate is the crowd cheering. Yeah, it sounds like the entire first half of this project is coming from some big stadium concert, but actually all the crowd noise is fake. It was all directly sampled from the concerts of other bands, such as The Doors or U2, who were becoming infamous for being quick to litigate, in an attempt to really expose how much of a dickhead you had to be to pursue them, especially for sampling something so minor and unrecognizable. And most amazing of all, U2 actually took the bait and sued them into taking the crowd noise out. Not gonna lie, that is legit brilliant. Props for that move alone. And it's stuff like this which prevented them from getting accused of being sellouts for putting something this commercial out. I just wish I could actually recommend the album itself. I just have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. On one hand, instrumentally, this project is great. All these well-textured, polished acid house melodies and grooves. They're all super smooth, they sound great, they're mixed really well. Heck, even the singers and rappers would sound great over these instrumentals if the lyrics weren't so completely inane. I'm so conflicted on it. Nearly every track is really close to being really good, but just has some element that I can't get into, be it a super corny verse or an oversold R&B vocal performance. And it's always the vocals that take it down, every time, never the instrumentals. 3 AM Eternal and Last Train to Trancentral have great tunes behind them, and What Time Is Love is a great acid house groove that even borders on epic. A lot of this stuff could work really well in like an early Guy Called Gerald sort of way, I guess. But the rappers on top are really cringy, and take me out of the experience, as do the shouting choruses of Moo Moo on the latter of those cuts. Last Train to Trancentral would be my favorite track here if it weren't made redundant by the existence of Wichita Linemen was a song I once heard, which has all the parts of this track I like and none of the parts I don't like. This version is basically just a less interesting and less textured, radio-friendly cut of that track. And while I'm on the topic of tracks that are like made completely invalidated by other versions that exist elsewhere, the same deal kind of goes for 3 AM Eternal and What Time Is Love, which had far stronger original single versions. Their pure trance versions were released like in 1988 and 89. Those versions don't have the rap verses. They go on longer. They just sound way better than these much cornier LP cuts and are much more worth your time, especially considering these two tracks, the original single versions of them, may be some of the earliest ever examples of trance music like ever created. So that's a thing too. Build a Fire had a great instrumental with even some steel guitars like those on Chill Out, but also this weird, rambly spoken word thing that kills that mood as well. Similar deal with the title track, although it's not as intrusive a problem there, and it does have a nice clarinet solo too. That track's probably the least cringy moment here. And I also don't mind Make It Rain, aside from its weird, out-of-place, really fake-sounding sax solo. Church of the KLF almost builds into a pretty neat ambient vocal space and even has a cool change-up partway through, but ends in a hard cut out of nowhere before even hitting the 2-minute mark. Meanwhile, No More Tears had the gall to go on for almost 10 minutes and require you to sit through all this ridiculous scatting over an airy and atmospheric piano-driven instrumental with a kind of annoyingly cheery melody. I was like, okay, this is wearing out its welcome, you can stop now, when I saw that I was only halfway through the track. And the rest of the track went on to showcase no new ideas from that point. that one's just a freaking slog. Also the ending with Justified and Ancient. That has a good hook, but god does it hit a weird note to hear such a cutesy and saccharine sounding tune directly about Caudy and Drummond themselves and how they make good music or something. I just have no idea what to make of any of this album, especially now that it's 30 years later and we are so far removed from the original context and the scene that it was revolved around. I'm gonna be honest, after enough reading into its background, I can kinda respect it for how it basically lampooned the whole music industry of the time, while still being pretty well produced, and could be enjoyed on a surface level if you could get past the more painfully dated elements. But, I don't know, I'm starting to think this might have been like the early 90s equivalent to what Calvin Harris did 16 years later with I Created Disco. An album that, while it has a lot of great elements that still keep it well remembered by those who were there at the time, is undercut by this constant sense of spiteful, self-defeating cynicism. Like the guys making it are having more fun taking the piss than they are actually making the music. Now, for what it's worth, I don't think this is quite as obnoxious or shallow as I Created Disco. The cringier elements here are both easier to tune out and much more clever in the way they're implemented. But there is definitely a parallel there, and I don't like it. And I'm sure I'm going to get some backlash for my take on this album in a similar way that I did for I Created Disco. Maybe I still don't get this album, maybe I never will as someone who wasn't there to see it in its time, but you don't need to know anything about the time Chill Out or Space came out to enjoy those. And there's even better house music out there that sounds kinda like The White Room from even before it, that I'd be more willing to believe had a greater impact on the scene. I mentioned a guy called Gerald's earlier work, like Automanic and Hot Lemonade. Not nearly as commercial, but could scratch a similar itch with its instrumentals without the jokiness or piss-taking. And 808 State's material from this time blows this out of the water, too. They were goofy, too, but they were sincerely goofy. The White Room, it's alright. I can't deny that it does have a few jams, pun intended. And I won't begrudge anyone who does still love it to this day. It'll do well for you if you have more of a stomach for 1991 cliches. But as a whole, I don't think it's really stood the test of time. Without knowing the greater context, it is definitely a project that leaves me quoting their debut from 1987 as the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo, and asking what the fuck is going on. I'm feeling a 5.7 out of 10 on it. And yeah, finishing on a weirdly ambivalent note, but that's pretty much all the thoughts I have to express on the KLF. So I'm gonna leave it at that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. But you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.